Hinhape Washte, Kayla Amachiapi. Good morning, relatives. I am Kayla Richards, and I have the honor and privilege of hanging out with all of you this morning and moderating this morning's panel, Reimagining Justice for Women. As an Indigenous mother, and at times a conflicted criminal legal system professional and scholar, and relative to currently and historically incarcerated community members, I am eager and so grateful to connect with today's panelists and engage in a restoring of sorts. A conversation of the current dominant narratives surrounding the experiences of women's pathways to, within, and from the criminal legal system. We know that these experiences are different. They're different, and they're often made to feel small within the larger criminal legal system discourse and conversation. And this is of a particularly important noticing that I have for our Black, Indigenous, and racialized women of color relatives, for our members of the LGBTQ plus two-spirited community and disabled community members. We notice this pattern as well. For the next hour, we are going to be in relationship with one another, brought together by the Minnesota Justice Research Center in our shared virtual space. And if this morning you find that technology is failing you, as it sometimes does, please feel free to shoot Emily a direct message or reach out to Zoom support directly. If you, like us, find that you are holding curiosity or are noticing yourself, please post your questions for the panelists in the chat, and we will have time for a Q&A at the end of our time together. Please also keep your mic on mute so that we can be tuned into one another and not each other's background noise. So it is with a deep gratitude and limbic system and intuitive knowing that I would like to open us. A knowing that how things currently are is not how they have always been. These are human-made problems. The beauty of that is that today we get to have a conversation about what re-knowing and reimagining might look like. So I am ready, as I'm sure our audience is ready, to hear a bit about each of our panelists. I'd really like to know how your work and your life experiences intersect with the criminal legal system. Who would like to get started?
I can go. So I am Kaylee Griffin. I am a juvenile justice system overcomer, I guess you could say. I guess given the place that I was, I could even say survivor. But I had a really traumatic experience in the juvenile justice system. I was in a domestic violence relationship. That's what kind of landed me there. And I was there because I was a run risk. And essentially the way that I was treated in there was so foreign to me. I was so angry with the way I was treated and the way that everybody else was being treated and the options that they had, that I essentially decided I needed to go to school and go above their heads if I could, and see what was going on. And so I went to school, Metro State. I got my bachelor's degree in psychology and criminal justice. And in the meantime, I worked for the Minnesota Department of Corrections as a student worker in the reentry unit. And then I left for a short time and came back as in the restorative justice unit, doing circles of support and accountability. And so my personal experience essentially has been the biggest intersection, I would say, with how I've come to this work. So it kind of guides me at every step. But what I found was that it's a lot more complex than I had thought. You know, essentially, as the deeper I've gotten into it, I, you know, through the years learned how much it's based on race and sex, and how this actually isn't anything new. This is something that's been happening for a really long time to all women and girls. But I think definitely American Indian women and Black women have gotten it significantly worse, and it's impacted those communities to I can't even really explain the detriment on those communities, but it's severe. And I think when we look we don't even know where a lot of the women and girls end up is the saddest part about it. We don't even know. And so just with that, I will just say, yeah, this is a guiding thing for me, and every single day it's a part of who I am based on that traumatic experience. It is a fire in me that it won't go out. So.
Thank you, Kaylee. So it sounds like you had this unique personal experience, and that's really informed your work now. What are you doing now?
So I'm a co-founder and co-executive director of a new nonprofit called the Until We're All Free Movement, as you can see here. And we focus on making sure that people who are incarcerated have access to invest in their internal long-term mental health. And so we're going to be rolling out our programs next year, but our first one's going to be our internal investment program, which serves incarcerated leaders, men and women, but leaders, particularly people who have already shown that they have the ability to carry themselves. They just could use a little bit of extra support, because we believe that that's what builds capacity for all of us. If we have more people out here strong, then we have more people to mentor and essentially be there for other people. And so that's essentially what we focus on now. I have whole plans of rolling all of this out for women and girls down the line, but we're still very, very new. We're only 6 months old, so that's where I'm at.
Congratulations. So it sounds like you're really focusing on what long-term wellness looks like compared to like how I think about current intervention is how folks that are incarcerated are good inmates or good incarcerated people. Like, how do we actually help provide support for overall wellness? I love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Theresa, what about you?
So bonjour, Benishi Wang Nipi Akwe Indigenous. I am Theresa Nord, and I am a parent mentor at the ICWA Law Center, but I am also a reentry liaison for the American Indian Prison Project. And like Kaylee, I am a formerly incarcerated woman. I've been, I guess, a little bit past the reentry phase, but I've been a community member for about 4 years now, a little over 4 years. So my incarceration is pretty recent, but like Kaylee, my incarceration really sparked an interest in wanting to give back in a restorative way. I seen while I was in prison that the vast number of Black and Brown women who really shouldn't have been there for a number of reasons. And I think most specifically around addiction. And, that was really what got me incarcerated was that I was an addict. And instead of there being systems in place or created that would prevent someone with a drug charge from entering the system, instead that is how society chooses to deal with those of us with addiction problems. And so I really, I knew very early on in my incarceration that I wanted to give back as soon as possible after release. And so I've been working really hard at just minimizing the stress and the overall, I guess, struggle of being released from incarceration, having lived through that trauma, and then, getting out to be a productive member of society. And, what that might look like for each individual is different. And it definitely was a struggle for myself. There is not housing for Native specific women who are being released. There are not Native specific programming that would help individuals become more successful after release. And so what we're seeing is this vast number of women being released back into the communities in which they committed their offense, and they're going back to what they knew prior to incarceration. And it's really, really hard to break from the chains of whether it be addiction or domestic violence, a whole slew of things. And so the recidivism rate is ultimately increased because of that. And I think for myself, that word recidivism was a super, super scary word. I did not ever want to go back into incarceration and live through that trauma again. Nor did I want my child to ever have to experience that trauma. Yeah, so again, I've been working through the Prison Project to just be a support for women that are being released and create a sense of healing for them.
Thank you so much, Theresa. I heard you say so much. And I heard some parallels when Kaylee was talking around like pathways to incarceration, and how for women and folks who identify as women, they really are different. And I also heard you talk a lot about coping and the way that we criminalize coping behavior. If you don't cope in a way that feels familiar or accepted by like dominant group, if you use substance, for example, to cope, you're criminalized and then incarcerated. So those are some noticings I had. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now it sounds like you're working really hard in connection with other women who are experiencing very similar things.
Absolutely. Yes.
Shatij, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody, good morning. My name is Shatij. I use she, her pronouns. So my experience is a lot different. So I am originally from Nepal. It's a small, beautiful country between India and China. And growing up, I did not have any experience with incarceration or prison system or anything, right? And, you know, what really drove my interest was, so my background is civil engineering. So I'm trained to be a civil engineer, and I was actually building a prison. Problematic, right? So, so you're in this bubble, right, where a woman is in the industry, which is considered to be very male dominated. So you want to be out there and do everything. So I was given this project. I was in charge of that project. And when we were doing that, I got to interact with a lot of kids, you know, and all of these kids were the kids whose moms were in the prison, right? And they had all landed up in the street because nobody was taking care of them anymore, because the stigma for a woman being in prison is a lot more than for a man being in prison, right? At least that was the case in Nepal. And that really shifted something in me, you know, and that is when I started working with these women and started working with these kids and started learning more about how the system has done so much injustice. And, you know, over and over, it's repeating that for women. And that really shifted my focus or my interest from what I was doing in the technical field to what I really wanted to do, where my passion lied. And that is when I started working with the systems and the correction facility back in Nepal. And then 4 years ago, when I came to United States to pursue my master's, I was in the Humphrey School. I really wasn't finding something that was aligning with my passion, right? Ironic, you come to a school that you really want to study something and you know you want to do, but then you don't find that. But then I was in this class, which is called action research, right? Participatory action research with the marginalized groups. And then there was a project on expungement. And expungement was and still is a topic that is very foreign to the global South. You know, that problem, that issue hasn't reached there yet, right? But when I read about it and when I was studying more about the criminal justice system and how women are affected by it in the United States, it really surprised me, because when you look at United States from the outer world, it's like, oh, it's like, that country which is like, working towards making, doing everything, because this is the model country, right? What the United States does, like everybody wants to replicate that. So that was my perception as well when I came here. But when I started interacting more with people, that wasn't the case, right? That isn't the case. And it's even more problematic here, And then I started working on the expungement project with the No Wrong Door initiative in the Hennepin County. And we were identifying, or we were looking at the systemic barriers to expungement. And that is where I realized that, okay, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to work with, right? And moving forward, we saw, because what I honestly believe is that if it is for us, it cannot be without us, right? You have to incorporate the voice of those people whom you are actually trying to support. So we incorporated participatory action research methods, and we started working along with the system, also with people who have not been treated well by the system, right? And our focus mostly was looking into a policy that already exists, right? So we're always trying to create new policies, but if there is something that can help, why not make that accessible? Why not make that easier, right? And we could only find like one person at that time who had actually been able to utilize that policy. How problematic is that, right? So that is where we are working on. And like professionally, I work with Rainbow Research as a research associate, but I also work pro bono. And we have a group along with 3 other friends of mine. We have a group called the Minnesota Clean Slate Alliance. We're not an organization or anything, but we all are passionate about this issue, and we want to make sure that, we utilize expungement and we utilize this policy that exists and make it accessible for anybody who can utilize this and go back and make the re-entry much more easier than what it is right now.
Wonderful, thank you. What a unique and interesting story. It sounds like the Creator had plans for you. You were building a prison and now you are working on expungement. And it's interesting because when you were talking, I was thinking about noticings around power and dominant narratives, like how the United States is perceived. And when we think about the criminal justice system, even the way that we label that system, the criminal justice system, justice for who, and what does that look like? And so I'm hearing your lived experience really be this process of noticing and rediscovering like the actual reality versus like what we broadcast, and what stories are told and believed because of our power. We know that Black, Indigenous, and women of color are significantly, and a number of us have talked about this, more likely than white women to be stopped by police, to be arrested, to be incarcerated. So at every sort of point in the system, we see a disproportionate happening for these women. And the proportion of Indigenous women sentenced to prison in Minnesota is significantly higher than the proportion of women of the other races. So I'm curious about how you have seen the interaction of racism and sexism in policing and incarceration. How has that shown up in your life or your work in your community? So how has that shown up? And then how do you think we can address that so that we can reimagine and shift that moving forward?
Kayla, for me, racism was a very, very new concept. Like you've heard about it so much, right? But you were not on the receiving end because racism isn't something that exists back home, right? There is like casteism, classism, and all of that. But just by the way you look, you cannot be discriminated when we are following like classism or casteism or whatever. And when I came to United States, it was so evident. And, and I was on the receiving end because I was being treated differently just because of what I look like, right? And what my accent is like, you know, and also like on top of that being a woman, right? There's so much of intersection, and there's like so much of discrimination that is overlapping, right? And anytime I would talk to I would meet people with lived experience, it would be so evidently different. You know, like we see that in reports, we see that in numbers, but any story that you hear from a formerly incarcerated women, right? It's like, it's very, very different. Like you don't even have to look at numbers or like anything, like it's very different. So I think for me, that was the realization, you know, when like people started looking at you and treating you different just by the way you look, you know, and just like having that conversation, even with like, you know, when you go and talk to police or like, you know, have that conversation with them, you know, just like that mindset, you know, it's like wired so much, you know, it takes like so much for them to, you know, unlearn, you know. And sometimes I also feel like it's so ingrained in us that by default we start doing things the white way. You know, we talk so much about, oh, intersectionality, like, you know, decolonizing this, like the world, right? But then what does that look like? We're talking so much about reimagining it, but what does it really look like? Like, do we even know that? Okay, so
Yeah.
that is something that I have been like, you know, reflecting over and thinking over so much, because like we're so ingrained in the white culture, the white way of doing things. So sometimes whenever I say like reimagining expungement or like reimagining criminal justice, like, okay, but what does it look like? Like what is it, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up. And I'm curious about what Theresa and Kaylee are thinking and holding. Because before we hopped on today, we were having this conversation about like knowing and like who knows what and access to knowledge and who are credible messengers. And often in, you know, white dominant culture, it's the professionals in the room, the folks who have the letters behind their name in the room. And for Indigenous people, we are living in a post-apocalyptic world, right? Like every day. And so when we talked earlier about like this not being the way that things have always been, I think most of us are socialized and sit in minimization around difference. So if we just treat everybody the same, if we just don't see color, if we treat other people the way that we want to be treated, things will be fine. But there are differences that make a difference. And that's what we're talking about today, right? And Theresa mentioned that about, you know, when she was talking about her lived experience. And so I think that there are communities and people who know and who have a sense of possibility, and often they aren't involved in those conversations. And if they are, there isn't access to like decision making, that there isn't like real power. And so how do we shift some of that, especially as those of us who have power? Theresa, I'm curious about what you are thinking about.
I guess what I'm thinking about definitely does not correlate with what I had planned to talk about. Kind of what comes to mind is a little bit, you know, for myself specifically, when my case started, I didn't recognize that race was a part of the dynamic, right? But looking back on it now, I see how absolutely the fact that, you know, I'm an Indigenous woman, I think, you know, when decision makers within my case and those that are in charge, the judges, the county attorneys, and so on and so forth, you know, seeing that I was an Indigenous woman who was addicted to heroin and had an open child protection case because of my charge, you know, all of those things, it was like, well, we're going to make an example out of this person. You know, and my case, at the time that my case came about, I was a full-time college student, you know, studying for community psychology and social work. And, you know, I had a back injury that resulted in being handed handfuls of pain medication, right? And so that's how my addiction came about, but they didn't see it that way. They seen it as this Indigenous woman who was low income, who, you know, got a drug charge and, you know, all of these things. And then, you know, now looking back on that, had it been a white counterpart, another student who I was going to school with, had they had, you know, had the same experience as I had, would they have been treated the same? Would they have been incarcerated for that drug charge? Would they have gotten the amount of time that I got? And I would like to think that, you know, I could answer the questions with, sure, they would have been treated exactly the same. But I think the reality is that no, they wouldn't have been. And so that's what the many, many, many women who I was incarcerated with and have worked with have experienced, is that same sense of, you know, wanting to be treated as an equal, but yet the circumstances clearly show that, you know, we aren't equal to the rest of society. And more specifically, I think women get a harder charge or harder outcome of their charge because of the fact that we are women. We get higher sentences to, you know, our male counterparts. And we certainly get higher sentences, you know, I think because of our race. And of course, that isn't something that is broadcasted, right? It's always a hidden part of the agenda. And I think the biases that continue within our communities, that Black and Brown people, women, are, you know, not capable of being productive members of society, and so therefore, you know, lock them up, you know, put them away. And I've seen so many women that I was incarcerated with that, you know, for the sole purpose that they were addicts or had experienced domestic violence or sex trafficking and things like that. So it's kind of a devastating and traumatic experience to go through, for sure.
Thank you, Theresa. I heard pieces around like how decisions are made about like the worthy and unworthy recipients of care. Like, how is it that as communities we communicate care? And the criminal justice system, which is why a lot of us term criminal legal system now, but the criminal legal system, you know, if the role is to provide support and care so that folks can return to being positive contributors in society, what assumptions and meaning are we making about folks' individual behavior and who is worthy of that support and who is not? And so that's what I was thinking about when you were talking, like how are we making meaning of that? Kaylee, was your experience similar or different? Like, what is it like for you as a white woman, as we talked a little bit earlier about that?
So, for me, one of the things that I had noticed is when I was locked up, I got in a lot of trouble. I was one of those girls that they had claimed that had entitlement issues because I stood up for myself. And there was I noticed this like with a lot of the other girls that they didn't get in as much trouble as me. And it also wasn't their first time there. And as I became close with one of the girls that I was locked up with, she was a Native girl. She lived on the reservation, and we actually got together after we both got out, and I went up to her house on the reservation. And through that whole experience of just getting to know her on a little bit of a deeper level, she pretty much was used to being treated that way, that when she went into that correctional setting, it was just another placement that she needed to get through. And that didn't sit well with me when we got out, because I didn't have any resources to do anything for her, but she wanted something different, but she had no pathway. And thinking about this, it kind of goes into the next question, but I think it's just important to lay this groundwork. All of this has not sat well with me enough where I've done my own little research. And when you look at the history of girls incarceration, it's actually pretty scary. I went to the Minnesota History Center and spent some time looking through the Sauk Center case files. I looked at individual girls, the case files, who was there, what they were there for. I'm talking like they have to be over 100 years old. So I was looking at like 1918, 1920, who these girls were that were being put into a placement. And essentially this placement, Sauk Center, the girls weren't allowed to go to school. They would essentially be worked in the fields or in the house. It was a horrible, horrible situation. If they had babies out of wedlock, they would take the babies and put them with an appropriate family. The reentry for these girls looked like being placed in a house with a married couple and them being the maid for that couple, which, oftentimes what would happen is the father or the male in the household would sexually abuse the girl. But when I looked at the individual reasons why these girls were there was one girl in particular who it said that she was there for being incorrigible. She was 14 years old. She was going to be there until she was 21. And it said that this girl has had sexual relations with her father and her brother and is carrying a baby by her father and has been running from house to house. So what they've essentially done, what I pieced together, is that they've always been locking girls up for running away, for truancy, for curfew. They just called it incorrigibility. That's what they did. Even if you were at a risk of being incorrigible, you didn't even have to do anything for them to lock you up. And so I think when you look at that history, what we see is that over time, all they've really done is change the language and tried to make a bigger, better justification for locking girls up. But it's really always been in their pattern, and it really ties into our entire American patriarchal system and the mindset. It's rooted in the same beliefs as much as races, and I think what we see when it comes to Indigenous and Black women is we see a compounding of trauma. So like we already had these communities that were completely traumatized and just completely dissipated by American violence. But then on top of it, you also have this other battle of like making sure we put women in their place. So on top of it, you have these Native women and these Black women in these situations coming from these communities where, by the way, now they're also caring for the children because they're taking away the men. They're putting the men in prisons. They're abusing the men too. And so the women are carrying the trauma of going through it themselves, and they're trying to fight for themselves. And essentially what I see is that we get addiction, and we're gonna criminalize a coping mechanism. We're gonna take the one thing that you're able to do to like kind of get you by through all of this trauma, and we're gonna capitalize on it. And then another thing I see is that there's no follow through with women or with girls. If a girl leaves the juvenile justice system and is out of state systems, they just say, oh, she's good, we did good, she made it. No one follows through to see actually where those girls are. And when I've looked at the girls that I was locked up with, one of them died. One of them is still actively in her addiction. Another one's a single mother who's not doing well. When we look at the trajectory of these girls, it's really not good. But if they don't end up in Shakopee, then we must have done something well. But I think what we find out is even when you look back at Sauk Center, when the girls would leave Sauk Center, oftentimes their death certificates were in their files too, because they died in their early 20s or something like that. And another thing I've noticed too, just to speak on, your situation a little bit, Theresa, is that we kill women. We take their kids. We cut them right at the core. You know how many times I've seen a woman lose her kids and her life just slowly spirals down to despair. And I've seen even all the way down to death. And so with our justice system, when we take women from their kids, we also make it really, really impossible for them to get them back.
Yeah.
And we just allow our women to be in this steady spiral decline where no one cares and no one is following up to make sure that women have what they need and that their kids have what they need. And I think, you know, even you're right, the kids on the streets are the same, they are the kids of the people who are incarcerated, because we also don't pay attention to the trajectory of their children and what it's doing to that next generation. And I think it also is tied in with daddy issues too. You know, I think it's the same thing when we take away fathers. We also are preparing our women and our girls to have codependency issues and issues with men. And so we also need our men to come out and be healthy. So it's like, I feel like everything needs to work in parallel, because our women need healthy men, our men need healthy women, our kids need healthy parents. And essentially we just keep pulling these key people away and making it and compounding trauma on people and making it impossible to climb up. So that's, sorry, that was kind of long and winded.
No,
but
you're fine. You're fine.
It's critical to understand that this is, you know, an ongoing thing that's been a history of America. And what we're seeing is that the suffering is just getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, it made me think about, I think you highlight a lot of really important pieces to the story. And I think we spend a lot of time, as somebody who's worked in the system, we spend a lot of time thinking about difference in terms of like how we allocate resources, or at least we talk a lot about that, right? Like gender responsivity, you know, gender specific programming, culturally specific programming. Like we talk a lot about that. And I often wonder how much we're talking about from the very onset, the stories that we hold about what family looks like, what coping looks like, what it means to be a mother. And Theresa, when you were talking, it made me think about just this threshold for acceptability for men, if you will, versus women. And when you mentioned like our sentences are harsher, well, you're a woman. This is wildly incorrigible comparatively, because we have these stories about what is familiar and what is acceptable when it comes to women's behavior or coping strategies. And I think, you know, we've got about 5 minutes before we jump into Q&A, but I want to get to this next question because I think we're all talking about it a little bit. Research from the Women's Foundation found that 40% of girls, compared to 20% of boys, surveyed in Minnesota correctional facilities, report that an adult in the home physically abused them. 25% of girls, compared to just 5% of boys, reported that there was forced, unwanted sexual touching by a family member. So again, I think we're talking about these pathways, right? How has violence against women and girls been linked to the criminal legal system in your life? So I think it's two parts. That's the first part of the question. And then the second really is, how are you working, or your community working alongside that linkage so that we can reimagine?
I think, you know, when we talk about sexual abuse or physical abuse that happens in the home, you know, or those that are incarcerated who have experienced it, it's a tough topic to talk about. It's a painful topic to talk about. And, you know, I remember when I first got to prison and being asked those really invasive questions about what my experience was like. And had I experienced that as a child? And yes, I have. And, you know, there's all these different intersections of, you know, this trauma that we have experienced as women who are in a much more vulnerable space than males to experienced this type of abuse. And, you know, our way, or at least my way of coping with that trauma was to use addiction to cover it up. And, you know, the numbers that I have seen, and I would be doing a disservice if I tried to pretend that I knew what the numbers were exactly. But just, you know, having seen the numbers are incredibly difficult to try to process. The amount of women who are incarcerated who have experienced that form of abuse. And you know, I think if it's talked about, there's that shame, there's the guilt, there's the blame, you know, where, you know, our male counterparts don't have to experience that necessarily. And I know for myself, when I was first incarcerated and being asked those questions, I was kind of snatched up out of my programming one day and brought into this office with this, you know, personnel that worked at the prison to really kind of do this deep dive into my family history surrounding that abuse. And I didn't know this person. He was asking me really invasive questions. And then he gave me a couple phone numbers and sent me on my way. Well, that opened up a whole new avenue of trauma for me. It opened up wounds that I wasn't, you know, prepared to talk about. And then I was just sent on my way without any resources for mental health care while incarcerated. And I think I'm going down a rabbit hole. I apologize. But, you know, I imagine there being, you know, a system in the future where we aren't shaming, blaming, guilting women who have experienced this and then capitalizing on it. You know, that, you know, if incarceration becomes a part of their story. I won't take all the time. I'll let some of the others chime in, but that's just some of the experience that I've had.
No, that's helpful, and I think provides really specific context. I want to be mindful of the time, but what I am hearing, especially Theresa, you talk about in terms of like moving forward, is this folks that I know call it receiving and believing. So listening to folks' experiences and just believing them. Not needing to pull up numbers, not needing to argue about the anecdotal experiences I have with my Indigenous friend, like just receiving and believing, and then making decisions, informed decisions based on those needs versus you said capitalize, which I think is a really good word because prisons make a lot of money. And so I think that that's really important. I'm curious if anybody else would like to add anything about how we might reimagine, especially for folks maybe with us today who are working in the criminal legal system and are curious about like, how do I approach this work or think about this work differently? How would you respond to them?
I think what Kayla, you just mentioned and what Theresa also shared, right, makes me really think we're not really thinking about what the root cause is here, right? Like, why is this happening? We're just like looking at, oh, this person did this, right? Maybe she said something or she did something and she landed. That's all that we're looking at. But like, we're not really diving deeper and looking into the cause of like, what is causing this? Like, why is this happening to her, right? I think that is something that I want to work on, is like really looking deeper and listening to the person, right? Listening to their story, where they're coming from, what history, what different traumas they've been carrying since generations, right? Because if you see, there's like a lot of generational trauma that puts us where we are at, right? So we cannot just like be like, okay, let's bring this service or let's do this and it's gonna, no, it's not going to work like that, right? Because we try to solve one thing and the next thing comes up, right? So really diving deeper and looking into the cause, or like, trying to really understand and meet the people where they are at, is something that I really would like to do and work on.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Kaylee, what are you thinking?
I just want to echo off of what she just said. Meeting people where they're at, I think one of the biggest things, working on such a close level with people who have come out of incarceration, and Theresa, you've really spoken to it too, is people underestimate the amount of anxiety and the mental health impacts after being locked up. I've even noticed that sometimes, yes, absolutely, people who have been impacted need to be at the table. They need to be listened to. They need to be a part of the solution. But I think we need to be very mindful at what we expect from those people, because asking those people to lead some massive thing or to do something without any sort of mental health support, without any space for them to find their way, is really detrimental. I know that for us, in what we're creating here at Until We're All Free, people come up here and they can just breathe, and that's everything. That's actually like, we end up providing even just a place for someone to come post up with their laptop and just be around other people who understand that we all got anxiety. We all kind of have our weird little things that we do because we're all messed up and we all have really bad anxiety. And I think I can't put a price tag on a space like that and what our space has meant for people to have a place to come up to and just be themselves, because the rest of this world will not allow you the time and space for you to grow. Everyone that's coming out of incarceration just feels like they need to hurry up and catch up on those missed years. I need to hurry up and get on the same page as everybody else, but they're struggling. There's not a whole lot of support out there. At least in prison, you go here for this, but you're just out here kind of on your own. And I think that we need to be really intentional about support, like circling up around our people when they come home. And, I'm a mother of two. And so another thing I've noticed, even specific with women, is that when they come home, they don't have any space to heal, because it's immediately caretaker duties. There is no grounding and getting used to this pace of life. It's just literally immediately toddlers running, or do this, do that, and it's like, when did they have the space to just chill for a minute and kind of like say, hey, like, I just went through a really, really traumatic experience. I need some time for me to heal. I'm not going to be all 100% right now until I get my feet wet and figure out what's going on here. So I feel like I say that just because in this era of like, definitely we want the people that are a solution at the table, but I want us to be mindful of what that looks like, and making sure that there's always space for those people to process their trauma or to have mental health things that they need to work out. And so that's just something moving forward I would like to see the community as a whole be trauma informed about.
Sure. Thank you, Kaylee. I heard some common threads in talking about, reimagining and how we move forward. And one of the things I heard was about context, and really thinking about individual experiences as individual, but also in the context of social identity and systems. And Kaylee, when you were talking, it made me think about when folks come out of prison, we often, go down the checklist: individual therapy, housing, this, without also thinking or having an awareness about how those systems also can and are harmful. As a social worker, I am very aware of the harm that my profession perpetuates. And also having an awareness of what we're asking from folks, and really also acknowledging that people are complex beings and are not just their incarceration status. And so thank you so much for that. We do have time for a couple of questions. And the first one really is Theresa specifically. Thank you for sharing part of your story. And there's some curiosity around whether or not when folks are asking you those really specific traumatizing questions, whether you think it was about connection to services or statistics or just to know, how are you making meaning of that?
I definitely do not feel like it had anything to do with services, connecting to services in any way, shape, or form. I certainly wasn't connected, and I don't know anybody that was. Unfortunately, when you're incarcerated, there's a doctor that will prescribe medication, and there isn't anything else other than that, which is really unfortunate. And statistically speaking, I would imagine that it does have to do with the numbers. And unfortunately, there's no follow through. Once you've collected those numbers, not even recognizing the bandages that have just been ripped off, right? Just to get your numbers. It's really unfortunate that they're not asking those questions to provide those services that are so badly needed. If I hadn't started had taken the initiative to start my healing journey when I did, my chances of, coming back out and continuing that way of life would have increased substantially, but it had nothing to do with the prison giving me any other opportunities.
Thank you. It almost feels voyeuristic, doesn't it? Like, I'm going to come in and ask you these questions so that I know, and we can publish this information that we've all known. We all have a knowing that when you walk into a prison, we all have like an image of what that might look like for a reason. And I hold deep curiosity about why it continues to look that way when we've known that it's looked that way. And so what would it mean to engage in culturally affirming, responsive programming, for example? We have another question that I think is really important based on our conversation. How can domestic violence services better support survivors, both in the prevention of incarceration and to address the needs of incarcerated survivors?
I don't want to be the only one to answer questions, but that's a super tough question to ask.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes, but you know what, Kaylee, I'm gonna let you take this one before I chime in.
Oh, we have some time. How can domestic violence services better support survivors, both in terms of prevention before survivors are incarcerated, but also during incarceration? How can domestic violence services support survivors?
For me, I really feel like domestic violence is very, very entangled with racial trauma a lot of times. Either that, or for a white man, I would say definitely toxic masculinity. But I think people have an idea of what a victim how they should behave after that. And so I would say it's really, really important to recognize that trauma impacts people in very, very different ways, and that people's responses to trauma are very, very different. There isn't, going to be, sure, there are some people who are easier to work with who have been traumatized, but it doesn't make that someone else's trauma response any less valid. And I would just say, I think you just have to make sure that you're a good match for who you're working with too. If you can see that this person's also not receiving you well, then maybe you're not the right person to work with that, person who's been victimized. Maybe, I think it really has to do with reading that person individually. I don't think there is an overall cookie cutter answer for working with people who have gone through such severe abuse. It really is an individualized thing. And just making sure that they know that how they are feeling is completely valid, that, that their response to what happened to them is normal, even if it looks different than somebody else. And I would say on the front end, What I see, at least what happened with me, is my chemical use was mistaken as the problem, when the problem was actually I was in an abusive relationship. And so I would say, I think it's really important that people who are working with juvenile girls or youth in any capacity be able to recognize when something is a symptom of something else going on versus whether that's actually the root of the problem. And I think if we could start doing that a little bit better and listening to girls when they speak and what they're saying is going on, I think we're going to get a better idea of what she actually needs. And if we could start to build healthy coping mechanisms into our youth and to our girls and to our boys, you know, I think that we're going to be more addressing the issues at the root cause rather than trying to do it later after an abusive relationship, after they were involved in some sort of thing with their partner that they didn't want to be involved in, you know, something. I think that's what it can transcend into if we don't actually address girls' needs on the front end. So.
Thank you, Kaylee. Theresa, would you add anything quickly before we wrap up this morning?
Yeah, you know, I think for me, the idea of a domestic violence advocate or organization coming in is to meet someone where they're at. Don't come in and be the end all be all savior mentality. This, you know, it doesn't work. You know, I've worked with many women who have had struggles with domestic violence. I myself have been a victim of domestic violence. And, you know, there's always been this savior complex that has come in and tried to be the end all be all to whatever situation I was going through. And all I needed was somebody just to listen and to not judge, or to provide actual helpful programming and references or referrals. You know, I didn't need the check the box, you know, domestic violence tool, you know, to fill out all this paperwork and just kind of be set in a tailspin where I didn't have an idea what direction I was going. And I find those to be super unhelpful. To have somebody come in and just say, it's okay, it's not your fault, I understand. Having that, you know, really empathetic approach, I would imagine would be much more helpful to folks who are experiencing that. But then too, for those who are incarcerated after experiencing that trauma, and you know, working very closely with you know, the Department of the Correction to implement programs that would be able to provide services that would be super helpful for women who have experienced that, because to my knowledge, there isn't any, or there wasn't any when I was there. And for myself, you know, my healing journey didn't begin until I started learning about historical and generational trauma, and then was able to start talking about my own personal trauma. And that was a game changer for me. Absolute game changer.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I heard so much and feel like we could spend most of the day hanging out together and having conversation and dialogue about such a uniquely important topic. But for those of us in the room listening, I heard pieces around tuning in to folks who are having lived experiences, receiving and believing, stepping away from pathologizing and like categorizing folks under these, you know, these groups of disorder, and really tuning in. And I really love, Theresa, that you talked about creating a space for folks to meet themselves, because that's what it sounds like you did. Like you had this opportunity to engage in deep self-awareness and who am I in the world and how did I end up here, both culturally, individually, and that has really allowed you to to have access to tools and to an inner knowing, like we talked about earlier. So I just want to thank all of our panelists this morning for shedding some light again on such an important topic. It's been really nice to spend time with you this morning, and with deep gratitude, we will end for today.